Ms. Tett, good morning to you.
Good morning to you as well. And I'm very sad indeed I'm not with you in Greece, because there is much that is uncertain. Is the weather is better where you are?
Actually, Ms. Tett, we also started with rainy weather, but we will fix that by the afternoon, I'm sure. So,
well, I'm bringing English weather then, I apologize.
Anyway, welcome, Ms. Tett. This is as you know, the 8th annual conference of the Greek Entrepreneurs Association, but along with other associations of entrepreneurship and labor. And we're very honored to have you, and we will play right after this starting point from you. We will play the interview that you kindly gave us a few days ago.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, I'll say a few remarks, if that works with your program, because we are at very momentous and important times. I'm sure that many people in the room are wondering what is happening to the world, what is happening to Europe, what is happening for the wider business climate. Because, of course, we have just seen the election of Donald Trump, which I actually predicted that he would win. I did not expect him to win with this bigger margin and effectively a landslide, and to end up controlling all the branches of government. But that has occurred at the very same time that we, of course, have seen the political turmoil in Germany. We have seen turmoil in France quite recently. And across Europe, we're seeing very uncertain politics too. A world where Meloni is seen as a stability pillar for European politics is not a world that I expected to see. So these are very uncertain times for business and for anybody trying to read financial markets or to set policy. So I want to say a few words about where I think this instability and uncertainty has come from and what it means for a place like Greece going forward. Because I think it's important to step back and realize that this explosion of populism and policy uncertainty is part of a much longer arc of history that has been developing for several years. And the way that I frame it is that from the really middle end of the 20th century, the type of people who are involved in global Western business or policy making or trying to build companies in places like Europe or anywhere else have tended to operate with 4 key assumptions about where the world was going. And those 4 key assumptions were that globalization was good, democracy was good, free market capitalism was good, and that technological innovation was good. And the assumption was that those 4 forces were basically spreading across the world, that they were likely to keep spreading across the world, and that essentially, although history was not dead, to use a phrase of Francis Fukuyama, the historian who wrote that famous book, The End of History, although he never said that history was dead, there was a feeling that history was going in one direction towards more and more progress and more, if you like, economic growth in the future. So that was the assumption that very much shaped what might be called Davos man or Davos woman. And I've actually had Klaus Schwab, the head of the World Economic Forum, visiting in Cambridge for the last 24 hours. But that was very much the dominant assumption. And the story of events in Europe and on the world stage, really since 2008, has been that all 4 of those pillars, or if you like, all 4 of the legs of a table on which we built our careers, have been steadily undermined or gone into reverse. If you start with the first one, democracy, What you can see if you look at an index like the Bertelsmann Democracy Index, which is produced by the German company, looking at countries around the world, what you can see is that countries across the world were becoming more and more democratic until 2004, and then the trend changed. And since then, you've seen increasingly autocracies crowding out democracies. And even democracies that are proudly democratic have had the democracy questioned and challenged by citizens. America is one example of that. If you look at the issue of innovation, we are coping with a profound paradox, because on the one hand, we are seeing more scientific innovations at a more rapid pace than in many ways ever before in history. I was having a dinner last night at Cambridge University with a number of computing, quantum, AI and life sciences professors, and they were talking, to take one tiny example, about the absolutely extraordinary implications of what's happened with AI and a product like AlphaFold in the field of biological science and research. And the fact that whereas it used to take each PhD researcher an entire PhD to identify one protein for life sciences, now you're doing this in a flick of a second. And the potential for life sciences and biology is just breathtaking today. That's just one example where AI and innovation is potentially transforming our world. And yet, even as we see this innovation explode, what we're also seeing is popular resistance and skepticism towards innovation rising very rapidly as well. You can see that most visibly in America right now, where we've got JFK Jr., Robert Kennedy Jr., essentially likely to become in charge of health policy, even though he has been essentially expressing profound concern and misgivings around the medical innovations and in particular vaccines. But you can see that in many surveys, and my favorite survey of this is the Edelman Trust Barometer, which comes out each year, which shows very clearly that not only is there a big gap between the level of trust in innovation between the elites and the mass public, but the only innovation that's clearly accepted by the mass public today is green tech innovation. So innovation is facing headwinds too. Capitalism is absolutely facing headwinds. Because if you go back to 2008, what you can see very clearly across the Western world is that starting with the financial system, the crisis of 2008 ushered in more government intervention to really quite a remarkable degree, first in banking, and then in money markets, capital markets. And then with the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you had intervention in all kinds of other areas like energy sectors and price controls in some countries. Before that, of course, you had COVID, which ushered in considerable intervention in a way that would have been unimaginable 20 years ago. And what's really striking is that if you look at the chart of industrial policy and subsidy measures that's compiled by the International Monetary Fund each year, what it shows very clearly is that although it used to be developing countries and emerging market countries which were responsible for most of the increase globally in industrial policies and subsidies, in the last 2 years, that has switched around completely. And there's not only been a dramatic increase in the amount of government subsidies and industrial policies and interventions, but there's not only been a dramatic increase on the world stage, but it's almost all occurred inside big industrialized countries in the West and China. And what we can see once again from the Trump administration is signs that that is going to simply accelerate, whether it's in relation to price controls on pharmaceutical companies, whether it's the fact that increasingly you're seeing the tech sector wrap itself in the national flag and nationalism and essentially work hand in hand with the government, or whether you can see in other areas governments are increasingly assumed to have the right to engage in industrial policy. And then the fourth pillar, if you like, of this four-legged table is globalization. It is wrong to say that globalization is dead. If you look at indices like the NYU Stern Index, which comes out each year in association with DHL, you can see globalization still creeping up across the world as a whole. They measure that according to 4 different aspects of globalization: the movement of people, the movement of money, the movement of goods, trade, and the movement of ideas. The movement of people has remained fairly stable except for COVID, on a rising trend. The movement of money increased rapidly in 2008. It then came down. It's since come back up again, but is now turning the corner as we begin to see some signs of capital market fragmentation. The movement of goods has continued to rise in spite of all the talks about tariffs, but of course there's now a real threat that will go into reverse as well, given what the Trump administration is threatening to do. The movement of ideas is the one thing that's really dramatically kept globalization on track, according to this index, in that it has continued to surge as internet connections have essentially knitted the world closer and closer together. But even that is starting to slow down. So the point is that globalization hasn't collapsed, but it's essentially slowing down quite considerably. And most importantly, the rhetoric around globalization has changed really quite dramatically, as you all know. Sitting in a country like the UK, which is reeling or suffering from Brexit still, we know that only too well. But Brexit was really just the leading edge of the storm. It was the first indication of the big shift in attitude. And what you've seen since then is increasing fragmentation, increasingly aggressive talk around all 4 aspects of globalization, and increasing practical shifts as well, whether it is the fact that you're getting immigration controls increasing, whether it's the fact that you're starting to see signs of more capital market fragmentation, whether it's the fact you're starting to see some hints of growing internet controls and firewalls, or of course the most immediate issue, which I'm sure many of you are watching very, very closely, which is the growing trade threats and fragmentation and the tariffs. I've been talking to people in the Trump administration at length around the Trump administration in the last few weeks about what Trump means if he does indeed press ahead with his threats of tariffs. People like Bod Lighthizer, the likely next trade secretary, are very explicit about their desire to put 60% tariffs on Chinese imports, 10 to 20% on everyone else, including the European Union. This, of course, is a very threatening move. It will almost certainly spark all kinds of tit-for-tat escalation. And if you look at the IMF World Bank, they came out with a report a few weeks ago showing very clearly that this will hurt growth across the Western world. And if you look back to a report that the IMF did at the end of last year, looking at what would happen if the world did split into 2 trading blocks based on the votes in the United Nations that might be roughly equated to the allies and everyone else, or rather what you might call the axis of an intent, that's what it's called in Washington. If the world was split into a new Cold War and only trade with those different blocks, not across the blocks, you're looking at a loss of about 7% of gross domestic product across the world as a whole. So globalization is under attack too. So if you put those 4 things together, we're living in a world that really is quite different from the dominant mantra that most of us grew up with and built our careers on. I think you know that only too well sitting in Greece, because in many ways you are on many fault lines of where these big shifts in the tectonic plates are actually occurring. And the question it leaves for many people like yourselves who are trying to build a rational, forward-looking business climate is, what on earth do you do? How do you juggle this new conflicting landscape and all of these new pressures that are emerging? My answers, for what it's worth, is firstly, don't panic. Because the reality is that history goes in cycles. And in the past, we are essentially, we've seen these kind of patterns erupt before. In fact, in many ways, what we're seeing today, and it may not be very comforting, is an echo of what happened 100 years ago. Because before World War I, the world had also been dashing at breakneck speed towards more globalization, more capitalism, and more innovation. And in many ways, that seemed to be good. History seemed to be going in a straight line. Then it got knocked back. And of course, the world went into reverse. And I think there are many echoes with what we're seeing today to what happened 100 years ago, which is scary. There's no doubt about that. But the reality is that if you are a business leader, you also know that uncertain, volatile times can also be moments of tremendous opportunity and growth, and great fortunes can sometimes be made in these times of turbulence. So my first message is don't panic, because in fact, there are always, if you're trying to build businesses, if you're trying to create companies, there will always be opportunities. My second message is that if you believe in the 4 values which shaped our world growing up for the last 30, 40 years, now is a time when we urgently need to stand up and fight for them, and not just take them for granted and not just be complacent. The only good thing about what's been happening in terms of the onslaught on democracy, for example, is that it has made some voters and some peoples really appreciate and recognize and stand up for democracy and the values of democracy. And if you like, civic values that have been associated with the West for many years. You can look at something like Poland, for example, as an example of where voters have actually chosen quite mindfully to go down that path. If you believe in capitalism, now is the time to stand up and say, actually, we don't like these industrial policy measures. We actually want to have freer markets, and we need to fight for that. And if you believe in globalization, exactly the same thing. It's very striking how many people in Britain today, for example, have, if you like, second thoughts about Brexit, because they've realized that actually barriers and walls are not a good thing. So that's my second message. And my last message really comes down to what you are all doing today, which is growth. Because in my view, the single biggest reason for this shift in the global climate, if you like, the political economy climate, is the slowdown in growth, is the fact that increasingly the younger generation in particular, but voters in general, have realized that the extraordinary optimism that was around in the second half of the 20th century about where the world was going and about the ability of those 4 trends, innovation, globalization, free market capitalism, and democracy, to keep delivering growth, that optimism has gradually run out. And what we're seeing now is really voters who are very angry about the economic climate, who say that even if the elites are enjoying the economic benefits of those 4 factors, ordinary people are not, and who are essentially losing faith in the future. And the opinion polls showing the level of pessimism and negativity is very, very striking. Again, last night at dinner in Cambridge with the scientists and the World Economic Forum, people were saying, well, what can we do to get people to cheer up and believe in the future? And we were saying, well, talking about science and innovation has got to be it. But the problem is that people don't feel it. I know that you are talking about all kinds of things that could unleash growth. I know that what small companies are doing, entrepreneurs doing, is absolutely essential to that. I spend a lot of time, frankly, arguing with people in Britain about the policies they are or are not introducing to try and foster more business growth and entrepreneurship. And personally, I'm very disappointed that the budget which the British government produced a few days ago had really very few measures designed to unleash growth amongst entrepreneurs in the UK. They're taking entrepreneurship, frankly, for granted. And to my mind, sitting in Cambridge, where we have endless numbers of spin-outs and entrepreneurial scientists trying to create new companies here in Cambridge, I think is very disappointing. But this is the last point I want to leave you with. What is happening on the world stage in many ways creates a remarkable opportunity for Greece. Never mind the climate, never mind the very favorable position that you're sitting in. A world in turmoil, a world where conflict is breaking out in Israel, where some people are saying they do not want to go to America, a world of rising uncertainty in many ways, and a world of tremendous amount of government intervention in parts of Europe, is also a place or in a time when a country like Greece could, with radical policies, with a welcome mat, with a bit of creative thinking, and with a bit of boldness, really potentially reap the benefits in terms of the business climate and the entrepreneurial climate. I know that you've been campaigning for many things like marginal tax policies, which personally I think have a lot of merit to them. But whatever policies you wish to embrace as a group and promote and talk about, I would simply leave you with this. The world is very uncertain. We're seeing a big shift in the tectonic plates. But as anyone who's an entrepreneur knows, uncertainty and volatility doesn't create problems, it also creates opportunities too. And right now, I think there is an opportunity for Greece if it has the courage and imagination to take it. And I'll simply end by saying, good luck. Thank you.
Ms. Tett, thank you very much. You've been extremely generous with your time, and we really appreciate that. What's going to happen now, first of all, we're going to show the interview where we are a little bit more perhaps specific on certain issues that we discussed in Cambridge. But really what you just described now, the theoretical or the fundamental principles behind of what we're living today, globalization, democracy, free capital markets, technology, it's very important for us to understand so that we can put those specific things we discussed in the interview in a proper context. And as I told you in Cambridge, I would really be we would all be grateful if you write a book about those things, and shortly, of course, because you never know, after a year, things may change again a lot. And I think what you just described, the fundamentals, the fundamental forces behind what we see in specific events, is very crucial. Thank you very much, and we're looking forward to having you again, and definitely to read your next book. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, and I wish you all the very best of luck with your conference.
Thank you, Ms. Tett. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
No. Good morning, everyone. We're here in well-known Cambridge, a hotbed of technology in the United Kingdom. We're happy today to have a discussion with Ms. Gillian Tett that most of us read and know. As a brief introduction, Ms. Tett, a very well-known journalist at Financial Times, but also the chair of the editorial board for the Financial Times. The reason we are here actually in Cambridge is because Ms. Tett, among other things that she does, happens to be the provost of King's College in Cambridge. Ms. Tett, good morning.
Good morning. I'm delighted to be here, and I should say that I'm the former chair of the editorial board.
Okay.
I'm still a member, but no longer chairing it.
Okay, very good. So less, more time to do other things. Thank you for giving us your time to discuss. I know you're very busy, to discuss some relevant currently hot issues and focusing mostly on global industrial policy. As it so happens, we could not have picked up a better day to have this discussion because, as you know, yesterday we had the Trump election, but we also had, right after that, the collapse of the German coalition government. Now, in Germany, the issue on the surface is the budget, but really behind this is really the different industrial policies, if I may say, between the Greens and the Liberals. Ms. Tett, Gillian, what is your comment on yesterday's development and how they affect industrial policy? The reason why I'm saying and asking this question is, in a recent article that you wrote, which I found personally very interesting, where it is a title, How to Tell Good Industrial Policy from Bad. Basically, you argue that the consensus seems to be that industrial policies that try to create growth, mainly export growth, are far more effective than policies that try to shield domestic companies from foreign competition. And of course, that would happen, for instance, through the use of tariffs. Well, now it seems the US will use more extensive tariffs. So what is your view on this?
I think we are at a very interesting junction point in history, because for the last few decades, the liberal orthodoxy, which has shaped so much of the Western thinking, has essentially assumed that industrial policy was bad. And groups like the IMF very much criticized countries which were using industrial policy. And each year, the IMF put out a report on which countries were engaging in industrial policy and which ones were not. And what that showed was that industrial policy was primarily a developing market phenomena, not a developed market phenomena. Now, early this year, the IMF put out a new report which pointed out that actually industrial policy measures around the world have exploded, and almost entirely down to developed large economy actions, not the developing world. And the IMF itself, like most Western governments, has changed its attitude and now appears to be endorsing industrial policies in some contexts. However, there is a crucial caveat, which is that, as you say, there are differences between industrial policies which are designed to coddle and protect domestic interests from international competition, and those which are more clearly designed to enable a country to develop the type of industries which might export on the world stage and be better placed to actually compete globally. And the evidence suggests that the former, while it can be helpful in the short term, tends to undermine a country's competitiveness in the long term. It's the latter which countries should be aiming for now. The question, though, is how? And the question also is, how does that dovetail with rising national security concerns, or to put it less politely, a world of rising nationalism and protectionism?
Yes. Well, then, okay, but let me try to challenge a little bit something here. The US, because we're talking about the US, and then we can start discussing about Europe and about Greece and so on, and you can tell us your opinion. But in the US, it is already an export-driven country in the sense that it's globally, it's present everywhere, okay? It's not like I would say a country like China in the older days that wanted to conquer export markets. One way or another, they are there, maybe through digital companies. But the point is, what they're saying, actually in Financial Times, one of the ex-Trump officials argued, it was I think a few days ago, that, well, you know, don't blame us about wanting tariffs, because it's just a result of having a very protectionist country like China throwing this industrial policy at us, so we have to react. So on the one hand, the US does not really need to do an export-driven, perhaps, but it's more to protect its industry in the face of Chinese, aggressive tactics. So,
well, there are several aspects of what's happening here which need to be unpicked. One of the great paradoxes of America is that its companies are dominant on the world stage. And actually the footprint of American companies in terms of global league tables of companies has actually increased in recent years quite dramatically, even amid the rise of China. A lot of it's down to the rising tech sector, the so-called Magnificent Seven, but it's not just down to that. So America has a massive footprint in the global corporate landscape. But although its exports are notable, as a proportion of overall gross domestic product, they're not as big as in most of rest of the G7 countries. So ironically, the American public is not keenly aware of the need to keep exporting to the same degree as in other countries.
I see.
And that impacts the political debate quite significantly. Now, in terms of America's relationship with China, there is a sense of really bruised feelings on both sides. I sometimes liken it to two people who were dating and they break up, and then they become incredibly angry and irrational, hostile over all kinds of things that in other contexts might not seem quite so inflammatory. But, China and America have this paradox that they are utterly entwined economically through their trade links and through the supply chains, but also, frankly, financially through their, the fact that China holds so many US assets. So, frankly, you couldn't orchestrate a rapid breakup even if you wanted. And yet, there's a level of anger which unites both the Democrats and the Republicans towards China and a perception that they have to get tough on China. And that is spilling over to a much broader, more bellicose approach to the trading system. And it's fostered in the Trump administration by a very deeply held belief that the only way to be taken seriously is to be utterly unpredictable and angry and threatening at all times, and to threaten to burn down the house, to rip up all the trade rules all the time. Because even if you don't do that, you have to say you're going to do that to actually get some attention. So you have these different elements combining at the moment and making a very uncertain trade environment. And in many ways, that's also feeding through and interplaying with industrial policy. Just to cite one example, I was with Bob Lighthizer and others in Canada earlier this year, where he said to the Canadians, we're going to have 60% tariffs on China and 10 or 20% on everyone else. And the Canadians said, well, you can't do that because we're in NAFTA, or in USMCA as it's now called. And Lighthizer said, I absolutely can do that. No trade deal is forever. You have to constantly remake them. And that reflects the Trumpian approach to trade and, by extension, industrial policy. It's not a universal vision of the law. It's a much more situational vision of the law. And that's a very different tone from what we've had in the last few decades, although, of course, it is rather similar to what we had 100 years ago.
I see. So in one sentence, if you can, Gillian, what do you think is going to happen once those tariffs are imposed? What would be the net result? And especially for Europe, as we start trying to switch the discussion to Europe, what do you think, if you were forced to predict what's going to happen because of this, once they do the tariffs, because they typically will do them, right?
Well, I think what's going to happen is they will announce them. There'll be screaming and shouting and drama.
Right.
And they will then wait to see whether the Europeans respond by giving way on various key issues or not.
That's an interesting thought.
I suspect that the Europeans will probably then be forced to introduce some kind of tariffs themselves in response. That is my best guess. But I think there's going to be a lot of negotiating, a lot of shadowboxing, and we'll see how much the shadowboxing actually turns into real physical damage or not.
I see. Well, it sounds reasonable what you're saying. And that gives me the chance to switch to Europe a little bit in this field of industrial policy always, and as a result of Trump election. With this background, and also with the background of Monti report, which seemed to have an effect, at least in being debated within Europe.
The Draghi report.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Exactly, the Draghi report. What do you think is going to happen? Will Europeans be able to shape an industrial policy? Because there are so many different voices in Europe, which is good, but very bad sometimes also.
I think there is an urgent need for Europe to shape an industrial policy because at the moment it has the worst of both worlds. It is neither an entirely free market-driven, private enterprise-focused economy where essentially innovation and private enterprise can flourish freely, nor is it actually a state industrial policy saturated economy where you have intelligent joined up thinking about what are the industries of the future, as say in China. So it's neither one nor the other. It's muddling through. Maybe muddling through in the current global context is the least bad option you can actually have. But I would agree with much of what Draghi wrote. There's an urgent need for Europe to find ways to both unleash dynamism by removing a lot of the bureaucracy that's been hobbling private enterprise in the past, but also to double down on key industries of the future and to make sure they have joined up infrastructure that can support that.
I see. So you're optimistic about that maybe all those events that happened, especially yesterday, will force Europeans.
What I'm optimistic about is that, if nothing else, Trump has an ability to shock over and over again in all kinds of aspects that he touches of his life. And the sheer shock of the Trumpian second term, both in terms of geopolitics and the threat it poses to institutions like NATO, which I think will shock Europe into actually getting serious about its own defense. But the shock of Trumpian policies on tariffs and potential industrial policy, I hope, will force Europe into finally getting a sense of urgency about the need to act. Because one thing we know about Europe in the last few decades is that time and again, it's not until there is a crisis that change actually happens in Europe.
That's true.
There's a very strongly held belief amongst the European leaders that European Union needs to hang together to protect peace. So I'm not worried about Europe fragmenting as such completely. I do think when push comes to shove, Europe hangs together. But it seems that the corporate governance model they have is that unless there is a complete sense of crisis, unless they tiptoe to the edge of the cliff and look over and decide to not go over, that it's very hard to get the sense of urgency to break through the different interest groups and get a consensus about the need to act.
I see. Well, that's awesome. You think, again, to wrap up the discussion in Europe into what do you think, if you were to say, what would be the first two things that Europe would do, let's say, if they are forced and they decide to act? What would it be in terms of industrial policy? Would it be a sectoral emphasis? Would it be an across-the-board, another policy? Do you have any?
I think personally it would be sectoral emphasis. I would like their green policies to rely less on sticks, less on regulation, and much more on carrots, like the IRA. I think that would be a lot more effective to unleash animal spirits. And secondly, I think that there should be a wholesale doubling down on AI and life sciences and quantum computing, and a recognition that if Europe is going to have a really thriving venture capital industry, there needs to be a lot more discussion about wealth creation. There need to be tax codes that reward wealth creation, and there needs to be a lot more respect for entrepreneurs.
I see.
It is, after all, a French word.
Yes, exactly. And of course, let's not forget, we're sitting here in Cambridge, an amazing, I would say, success story of spin-offs from the university.
We are absolutely going down the path of trying to promote spin-offs and entrepreneurship.
Yes.
In fact, King's College has its own entrepreneurship lab. We created it 4 years ago. We were the first Oxford or Cambridge college to do it. Historically, it's not been the kind of thing that elite universities in England did at all. In fact, previously, people scorned entrepreneurship. But there is a growing recognition that we need to start seriously looking at ways to take the brilliant intellectual capital that sits here and trying to use it for growth-supporting companies and entrepreneurial thinking. So we have an e-lab, and it's now growing very rapidly. And I'm very pleased to say that it's one of the most dynamic parts of the college and one of the most exciting parts as well.
Good. Well, we wish you good luck.
Thank you.
Europe, we believe Europe has to have a United Kingdom one way or another, engaged, married, whatever you want to call it. But we do want, because it is really a source of technology, United Kingdom.
I'm in the camp of those who think that Brexit was a tremendous national tragedy and a huge self-sabotaging own goal. So I fully agree with you.
Yes. Well, I hope so. I mean, the feeling is that, as Financial Times reported, that somehow this new Labour government cannot go back to Europe officially, but it will do it in so many other ways indirectly. So I guess...
Well, let's see and let's hope so. I mean, personally speaking, I think the one natural way to start, since we're sitting in university, would be to create more freedom of movement for young people between continental Europe, European Union and the UK. I am heartbroken by the fact that the students here who are British can't just travel freely in the European Union as I did. When I was their age in Cambridge, I studied at Cambridge, you know, my friends and I used to go to Europe. And the people who didn't have money would go and get bar jobs all over Europe and spend summers working in bars in Spain, Italy, and Greece. We were probably half the waiters were probably, you know, students from England, and that was wonderful. And we had lots of students coming from continental Europe to Cambridge. It is tragic that that has stopped, and I hope that changes.
I fully agree with you, and I think all Europeans fully agree with you on that. Okay, let's now switch to Greece. And the main debating points we have in our Greek Entrepreneurs Association 8th annual conference, which basically are, if you allow me to list them. The first thing is that we believe, and this is not just Greek Entrepreneurs Association, but also the most important employer and labor organization in Greece. We seem to come to a consensus, which, as you know, in Greece is not always easy to do so. Anyway, the whole point is, number one, Greece must reindustrialize because it lags behind its European Union peers. And the question to you will be, what's the best way for a country like Greece, which is behind, to achieve this? We also, what we're saying, which will lead us to the second part of our discussion, second and last part, what we're saying is that reindustrialization really involves high-tech companies, of course, or companies, even the food sector, that operate in a high-tech production environment. This, of course, necessitates very quick reskilling to increase productivity, which, by the way, you know very well that the number one issue, I think Martin Wolf mentioned that yesterday in Financial Times, one of the number one issues in Europe is the low productivity we have, the growth of productivity. It has been tremendously low as opposed to many years ago. So the question is, in Greece, what we're saying, because again, we also don't have enough skilled personnel, but we have to rely on our existing personnel. What we're saying is we have to do something out of the box, start a revolution from the bottom to the top, which would be by, because we also have a lot of our Prime Minister advocated we should increase wages in Greece, and indeed we have to increase wages, but obviously, as you know very well, Gillian, you cannot increase wages just like that if they are not associated with the increase in productivity. So to increase productivity, you have to retrain and reskill your workers and so on. But the problem in Greece is that we have, for every, when we want to increase salaries, first of all, we pay 3 times the cost of it, what ends up in the pockets of workers. So in order to induce them, our colleagues, I would say, all the employees to go into a training, we have to provide higher salaries, which is, again, is what the government wants us to do. But what we're proposing is to use marginal taxes and allow us to reskill under certain proper procedures all our workforce, increase the salaries, but do not pay the non-wage cost, which is, as I said, is 1 to 3.
Right.
So this is in a way to start a revolution, but of course the employers have to invest on that, and this is a use of marginal taxes. In other words, you increase the workers under certain condition of reskilling, but you tax differently, and this is exactly what I wanted to end up today in our discussion, is what Germany is toying with the idea, which also Financial Times reported for the first time, which was, okay, let's induce people to work more and we will tax them less for the extra.
Well, all of that sounds very sensible. So broadly speaking, I would absolutely support it. I would simply add, and I'll sort of end here by saying that I don't think it should be the only measure. Okay. I think there also needs to be, if I had a magic wand, I'd be giving people golden visas to come and live in Greece if they bring in entrepreneurial and tech skills. We've seen how in Portugal how that can work. Ironically, in the aftermath of the Trump election victory, I suspect there'll be a lot of people who are willing to be mobile and would like some door into the European Union. So I think Greece should be offering golden visas immediately. I think it should be using the fact it is close to water and has lots of sunshine to double down very fast on renewable energy to the maximum amount it possibly can. I think it should be creating tax breaks for entrepreneurs and high-tech industries, and also investing in education, not just by boosting skills in Greece and training inside Greece, but also by essentially encouraging people who want to go overseas to then come back with their skills. But, you know, Greece and Europe has a great moment right now, because not only is there a large number of people fleeing from Ukraine, from Russia, places like that, but they are likely to be people who are looking for somewhere else to base themselves other than America in the future, and they need to act fast.
Yes. No, first of all, the fact of the matter is that in Greece we have golden visas, and the government has very correctly started pushing in this direction. The nomads, as we would call them, the technical nomads, call them whatever you want to call them. And also, it has done, I also agree with you, actually, when we had, during the crisis in Greece, we had a tremendous brain drain. People were coming to the UK, everywhere, and that really affected even more the crisis. But on the other hand, those people, as you correctly pointed out just now, they generated skills, and now that the government has also very correctly has given tax incentives. You know, you can have half of the taxes to pay when you return to Greece after being 7 years away.
Well, obviously, you know, things that are happening in the UK right now in the tax regime mean that there could be a great chance for Greece to jump in and have comparative advantage, and ditto in France. But it's a moment in time. The next year will be critical, but it's a great opportunity for Greece. Yeah. So good luck.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.